You guys, I'm excited, because today we're ranking the albums of one of the weirdest, wildest avant-garde metal bands around, Sigh. And honestly, if you're new to these guys, I'm almost kind of jealous because Sigh is easily one of Japan's greatest musical exports and the definition of the kind of wildly creative and unconventional music I seek out on this channel. So that said, let's dive right into it with Scorn Defeat in 1993. Always interesting to hear these more experimental bands at the start, and I'd argue Sigh already had some of that quirky flair right from the beginning, which isn't always the case. It's definitely on the slower side, but there is so much atmosphere, and Mirai has such a great voice that instantly stands out. But the real star of the show here is his work on the keys. Like, over the course of this album, you get spooky, swelling synths, classical piano, and harpsichord all to great effect. And the easy standout track here for me is the Knell, but admittedly it does drag on a bit, so not their best material, but already a pretty solid start. I'm going to put it at C tier. Then we had Infidel Art in 1995. This album further expands on the symphonic elements, also incorporating flute and other instrumentation that is only going to continue to grow as we get into these albums, but unfortunately it's not really in favor of really great songs in my opinion. They lean even more heavily into the doom metal elements, so if you dig that, you'll probably like it a lot more than I do, but personally, I find myself frequently bored. And on top of that, there are some attempts at singing here that I could definitely do without. Reminds me of the worst qualities of early Mayhem, basically, so yeah, definitely probably my least favorite overall. I'm going to put this one at D tier, but still, Sigh doesn't really have a bad album. But that brings us to kind of a classic in Hail Horror Hail in 1997. So this album moves much more into the sound I tend to associate with Sigh, with the faster pace and more chaotic sounding nature. Right from the top, we get much more emphasis on the guitars with wailing rock and roll and classic heavy metal sounding riffs, but once more contrasted by yet more expanded orchestration, this time delivering a full range of brass, strings, harp, basically an entire classical ensemble. 42, 49, and 12 Souls really take us all over the place, jumping from spooky, synth-infused black metal to smooth jazz, conjuring the uncanny vibes of a dream that's almost a representation of your day-to-day, but always just off in some way. The latter ultimately spiraling into a chilling nightmare before circling back to more classical elements. The constant twists and turns of the songwriting throughout the runtime is nothing short of spellbinding, honestly, representing a massive step up from the previous two albums and absolutely unique for the genre in 1997. And of course, more great piano here with a haunting sound that feels like it could have influenced Akira Yamaoka's work on Silent Hill. Definitely a seminal album that every metal listener should experience at least once. This one is going to A tier. So they followed that up with Scenario 4, Dread Dreams, in 1999, so this is an interesting one as I feel like it sounds more like the logical progression from Infidel Art, as it feels stylistically kind of halfway between that and Hail Horror Hail. You get more of the symphonic and experimental touches, but also some of those doomier vibes as well. As a result, this album feels like a bit of a step back to me. There are some really solid moments, but it all just feels much messier and inconsistent overall, especially after how great that previous album is. Black Curse and Imprisoned in particular started to grate on me after a few listens, but there are even more sections that I could just do without. Gotta appreciate Infernal Cries, Diabolic Suicide, and the fact that there's a legit waltz on this thing, though. So not the worst thing ever, by any means. I'm gonna put this one at C tier. But speaking of classics again, we get Imaginary Sonicscape in 2001. So generally, if you bring up this band and people know who you're talking about, this is the album that is going to come up 99% of the time. And for good reason, because this thing is a psychedelic masterpiece with broader influences from jazz and classical to Frank Zappa. Notably, this is also their first major label album with Century Media. Love the synth hook and bizarro electronic elements on Scarlet Dreams, easily some of their best synth work in general all over this album. Nietzschean conspiracy is like Portishead meets black metal. A Sunset song even further steps up the jazz. It's all over the place, and yet it all comes together just way ahead of its time. You could argue whether it's their best album, but I'd say it's definitely their most important. I'm going to put this one at S tier. And never content to stay in one place, they followed that up with Gallows Gallery in 2005. This is their first album as a 4-piece rather than a trio, and self-described as more of a power metal influenced album, at least from a Sigh perspective. Pale Monument is an absolute banger of an opener with some of their best guitar work to date, wailing away on those harmonies. In a Drowse really gets the clean vocals right this time, seeming to pull on similar influences as Ghost. Definitely a more guitar and vocal-centric album overall, frequently upbeat too, while maintaining the negative themes. Also, wicked sax solos coming more to the forefront alongside the dueling guitar harmonies on the occasionally thrashy Confession to be Buried. Midnight Sun is basically Sigh's take on swing music. Still some down moments too, like the drifting, sitar-infused and aptly named The Tranquilizer song, and really the first album I'd explicitly call a fun listen. Probably not what you're looking for if you want their heavier side, but personally, I find it to be a blast from beginning to end, so this one is also going to A tier. Next up, we have Hangman's Hymn in 2007. So fortunately, if you want to get heavy again, Introitus Kyrie has you covered, going almost full Emperor mode symphonic black metal. And speaking of which, the symphonic elements on this one, of course, come center stage, often seeming to weave the album together like a full-on musical. Inked in Blood continues the hellfire with more bombastic brass and hyped backing vocals. Lots of skanky beats and shredding solos, awesome chorals, church bells, and witchy cackles that keep popping up here and there that are really fun. Some of their best harsh vocal performances too. And talk about an epic and malevolent sounding conclusion to this thing. It may be one of their most aggressive albums to date, to the point that I'd compare it to like Nocturnal Mortem's earlier output. Definitely a highlight for me, very consistent. This one's going to S tier. And then from there we got Scenes from Hell in 2010, and I feel like this one picks up on a very similar note. Love the death metal growls from Dr. Mechanable on Prelude to the Oracle. The Red Funeral is a delight of both wicked black metal and their most impressive display of Baroque up to this point. That trumpet section at the end in particular is just magnificent. Likewise, The Summer Funeral is worthy of Carnegie Hall. Musica in Tempora Belli has an almost danceable breakdown, hoedown section with more death metal growls amidst a string quartet just stroking away. Honestly, it feels kind of like Hangman's Hymn Part 2, and there's no complaints here. They're even great to listen to back to back, so I'm actually also putting this one at S tier. Then we got Somniphobia in 2012. So this one ends up kind of dialing back that symphonic black metal sound, instead melding some of that aggression with the psychedelia of imaginary Sonicscapes, as well as some J-pop influences. Purgatorium is a great song that had me at a loss for words, from its infectious chorus to the organ solo. The Transfiguration Fear continues to offer this more upbeat vibe, almost sounding like it could be an anime theme song. Some great moments here with the backing vocals and clapping. Somniphobia has an absolute banger of a bass groove, acting as the foundation for more shredding solos and Middle Eastern inspired elements. L'Excommunication à Minuit is like Solo City. Saxophone, organ, and guitar all wailing away on this one. Amnesia has like a sexy stomp to it, fit for a burlesque show. Once again, every song is different, yet they all more or less come together. Ranking was so hard at this point because not only is every album great, but also great in such completely different and almost incomparable ways. Part of why I split this up into S and S-, I am going to put this one at S-, and only really because it's maybe not quite as cohesive as those top picks. And then there's Graveward in 2015. So just when you think that Sigh can't get any weirder, they still find ways to top themselves, with the big addition here being quite a few interesting clean vocal sections, which, speaking of J-pop and anime, this entire album is basically Sigh's Twisted Fever Dream version of those things. These are especially prominent on Cadet Nos Pestis, Graveward, and the Tomb Filler. Don't let them read your soul. alongside a wild fusion of basically everything they've played with up until this point, with notes of heavy metal, black metal, brass, occasionally 80s thrash-sounding hooks, neoclassical solos, and a lot of great saxophone. And the Tomb Filler in particular is such a great summary of just how well they managed to meld all these elements together into a deliciously enjoyable chaos. I am truly in awe of these compositions. Meanwhile, Out of the Grave is straight up one of the best songs they've ever made, period, with its baroque horn flourishes, raging sax, and impossible to not sing along with backup vocals, an entirely nihilistic romp through the avant-garde. Never before have I heard a song that is at once so ruthlessly insane and yet also insanely catchy. And then you have A Messenger from Tomorrow getting totally epic, seemingly out of nowhere. In my review at the time, I compared Graveward to a piece of modern art, just flinging paint like Jackson freaking Pollock, and I stand by that. Another one I'm going to ultimately put at S-, again, just due to maybe some consistency issues. Then there's Heir to Despair in 2018. Now, according to Mirai himself, this album was inspired by old, crazy, progressive bands like Brain Ticket, Embryo, and Agitation Free, and conceptually it takes the perspective of a person spiraling into the depths of insanity, attempting to convey the internal thoughts and experiences in the music. And the results, especially in the hands of this band, are about what you would expect. Aletheia opens the album with some serious atmosphere. It's a grand collision of Japanese vocals and Al-Nam rude energy laced with vocoder, sitar, and what I think is perhaps a topshur. This gives way to more tracks like Homo Homini Lupus and Hunters Not Horned, which share a lot of DNA with the Graveward material, except this time with a slightly more somber and serious sounding approach. Also, I never thought I'd hear Phil Anselmo, of all people, make a guest appearance. Personally, I kind of prefer the more ridiculous tone, but Immemorial Delusional is more in that vein with its thrashy guitars and machine gun harsh vocals. It gets pretty wild at the end too, with all the regional instruments, definitely a standout along with the equally chaotic hands of the string puller. Now the middle of the album is made up of the more imaginary Sonicscape reminiscent electronic energy of the Heresy trilogy, which is another interesting and on-brand move for the band, but not one I particularly enjoy listening to be honest, and I do think it kind of disrupts the flow. I actually tend to skip over this part if I'm not doing a deep dive. And then the album comes to a close with the 10-minute prog opus of the title track. Another very interesting album that continues to expand the ever-growing boundaries of this band, but it's also one of the most mishmash to the point that it almost feels like 3 EPs that have just been like slapped together. So for that reason, I'm putting this one at B, and y'all can let me know in the comments how you feel about that. Do you like this album more than I do? And then that brings us to Shiki, or 4 Seasons, in 2022. Now, first off, I think it's really cool to hear Mirai really lean into the Japanese harsh vocals on this one. But disclaimer with that right off the bat, I am going to butcher every single track name on this album. Just know I tried. Kuroi Kage, or Black Shadow, makes for a great opener with its super dramatic drumming on this one amidst the big, doomy, kind of Triptykon-esque guitars. Definitely gets me bobbing my head every time. And that's the perfect setup for the sudden deluge of raging distortion, blast beats, and D-beats that is Shuja Itsumetsu, or Desperate Living. Amazing soloing on this one. Likewise, killer drum solos and keys on Shikabane, or Corpse, which I believe are also provided by Mike Heller of Fear Factory fame. Satsui Geshi no Ato, or Killing After the Summer Solstice, takes a turn for the more dramatic again, feeling like it could be a part of some grand opera or musical in spite of its blasts of staccato, harsh vocals. Before ending on a conversely minimalist electronic beat, acting as kind of a segue to the very schizoid energy of Fuyu ga Kuru, or Winter is Coming, alternating Sonicscape psychedelia with caveman aggression. Speaking of which, Shoku is among the most heavy tracks on here, with plenty of black metal elements that are ultimately once more contrasted by the 70s prog vibes of Mayonaka no Kai, or Midnight Mystery, leading into the tranquil outro of Tuji no Asa, or Morning at That Time. It's an interesting album that covers a pretty broad range of their sound, but once more on the kind of subdued and ultimately stripped back side of the spectrum, which is ultimately thematically appropriate in that the concept and artwork are apparently based around Mirai exploring the autumn of his life with winter coming soon, watching cherry blossoms bloom as death creeps from behind. Definitely not one of my favorite albums as someone who likes their more bombastic side, but it is definitely morbid yet strangely beautiful, which is basically Sigh in a nutshell. So another one I'm ultimately going to put at B tier. Y'all check out this playlist for more black metal tier lists, and let me know in the comments, how would you rank these albums? If it's differently, tell me why. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off, and I will see you in the trenches.